Chapter 1. The Silent March. The desert wind screamed through the ruins of Nerekh-Ka like a dying god's last lament. Sand tore across the sun-bleached flagstones in choking waves, catching in broken archways and shattered columns. Statues of forgotten kings stood half-buried, their stone visages eroded and eyeless, staring eternally into the void. The sky above was a harsh, colorless expanse, unyielding in its indifference. Setemhotep walked through this graveyard of empires, each footfall a hollow clank of metal on stone. His bronze greaves, green with age and tarnished by time, thudded in rhythmic cadence as he marched along the ancient promenade that once led to the heart of the city. His armor bore the insignia of House Carrick, the sun disk flanked by twin cobras, though the sigil was now nearly effaced, worn down by centuries of scouring sand. Around him the city lived, or so he believed. He passed through the remnants of the bazaar, where wind-played chimes and broken pottery pieces created the illusion of bustling trade. In his rotting mind, Setemhotep heard the laughter of children chasing through stalls, the hawkers calling out their wares in joyous cadence. Spices from Zandri, silver from Lamia, perfumed oils of the Nile. He turned his creaking head toward a collapsed stall and offered a nod to a vendor that did not exist. "Hail, Sahim," he rasped, his voice a grinding whisper, like papyrus dragged across slate. "May your sales be as abundant as the Nile's bounty." A gust of wind howled through the ruins, dislodging the remains of the stall and scattering its rotted timbers like bones from a tomb. Setemhotep did not flinch. To him, the vendor merely bowed in gratitude and continued attending to a phantom customer. His patrol continued. He passed under the Gate of the Lions, now a half-fallen arch whose stone guardians lay decapitated in the sand. Here, Setemhotep paused. Once, the city's guards would stand at attention, breastplates gleaming, khopeshes drawn in ceremonial reverence. Now the only company he had were blackened bones and rusted weapons, buried in drifts of sand. Still, he saluted. His arm raised stiffly, the gesture cracked and awkward, held with rigidity of a man more statue than soldier. He stared at a blank space where a royal standard once hung, and whispered a prayer to Tree, the sun god, though the name barely surfaced in his decayed mind. It was more instinct than belief. The silence answered him. Further into the city he strode, past noble villas reduced to skeletal frameworks, their gardens overtaken by desert scrub. As he passed the central square, his ears caught the distant echo of drums and flutes. He turned his head slowly, every movement grinding like worn gears. Yes, the Festival of Ascension. He imagined banners fluttering, dancers weaving between braziers, children with painted faces clutching sweets. In his clouded vision, the air shimmered with illusion. He extended a hand toward a small girl, her face a perfect oval, her eyes wide and innocent. She reached out to him with painted fingers. Then the wind shifted. The illusion fractured. Where her hand had been was a crumbling skull, half buried in dust, its empty sockets staring into the abyss. Setemhotep staggered backward, a dry rattle slipping from his throat. For a heartbeat he paused, as if something old and long buried twisted in his mind. He righted himself, the phantom gone as quickly as it had come. The square was empty again, save for carrion crows picking at a desiccated corpse slumped against a fallen obelisk. The body was fresh, too fresh. Bandits or tomb robbers, perhaps. Setemhotep's mind struggled to connect the pieces. Intruders, were they rebels, foreigners? It didn't matter. He drew his khopesh with a rasping screech of metal on bone. The blade, once polished to a mirror shine, was blackened with age, its edge chipped but still serviceable. He knelt by the body. The man's eyes were gone, pecked out. His throat had been torn open, likely by the crows, but there were signs of struggle, scratches, bruising. A broken spear nearby. Setemhotep tilted his head. "Failure to defend the gate is punishable," he muttered. "The city must be safe. The pharaoh commands it." He dragged the corpse to the gutter of a nearby building and placed it in a slouched sitting position. He propped the man's head upright, angling it toward the road, and placed the broken spear across his lap. "There," he said, satisfied. "Stand your post." The body slumped to the side, toppling into the sand. Setemhotep didn't notice. He had already turned, marching on, his patrol unfinished. As the sun dipped low and bled red across the sand, the shadows of the ruined city lengthened like reaching hands. Setemhotep walked in lockstep with the past, seeing parades and royal processions where only decay remained. He was the last sentinel of Nerekh-Ka, and he would never abandon his post. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dust. The wind was wrong today. It slithered through the streets of Nerekh-Ka, not with its usual dry scream, but with a serpentine murmur, low, sinuous, and sentient. It curled through the remnants of archways, danced over the half-buried mosaics of jackal-headed gods, and circled around Setemhotep like a lover's breath, brushing the rents in his decayed armor, tugging at the ragged linen strips barely clinging to his brittle frame. It spoke. Setemhotep. The name drifted across the sands like a sigh escaping the lips of the dead. He stopped. The name was his. He knew it, somehow. It struck a chord deep within his withered mind, and like a hammer tapping a rusted bell, it vibrated through the hollow shell of his consciousness. His grip tightened on the handle of his khopesh. The leather binding cracked and flaked beneath his fingers. The wind crooned again. Setemhotep, protector, guardian. The world shifted around him. The sun seemed dimmer, the air heavier, and the light took on a strange ochre hue. He turned in a slow, grinding circle, his feet dragging through ancient dust. The ruins blurred at the edges of his vision like heat mirages melting into shadow. Yet he was not alone. Figures began to rise from the dunes, tattered silhouettes of long-dead warriors, faces shrouded in gold masks and plumed helms. They did not move, but they watched. Their hollow gazes burned into him, judgmental, expectant. He stumbled backward, but a hand caught his shoulder, bony, cold. He turned to strike, but there was no one there. Only the wall of the Temple of Eternal Day, its once pristine sun-carved reliefs blackened and flaking. He had stood here before, hadn't he? A memory tugged at him, uncoiling like a snake from beneath the sand. Fire, screaming, ash choking the sky, the scent of burning flesh. A moment, brief but bright, flared in his mind. He saw a crowd of civilians pressed against the temple gates, his own voice roaring commands above the din. Spears clashed with blades, foreign banners torn and bloodied. He saw himself covered in crimson, his own blood, someone else's, fighting atop a mountain of corpses, his blade slick and heavy. He blinked. The square was empty once more. Setemhotep. The wind moaned again, more insistent now. "You were sworn." To him, a flash of blue flame ignited in the corner of his mind, eyes staring from within a skull wreathed in gold and sapphires. A figure shrouded in ceremonial robes, incense coiling around his staff of scarabs and bone. The Liche Priest. Nerekh-Ka. The name struck him like a thrown stone to the chest. He reeled, clutching at his temples. His helm shifted with the movement, revealing part of his skull beneath, cracked, pitted, bleached. He remembered the priest's voice, not the gentle wind whisper he now heard, but a commanding tone like thunder in the catacombs. Nerekh-Ka had stood above him during the ritual of binding. He had looked down with sunken eyes, glowing like braziers. "You will not rest, you will serve," More voices joined the wind now, a chorus, mocking, pleading, accusing. "You failed us, Setemhotep. You left the gates unguarded. My children, where are my children, soldier?" The wind became a cacophony. The shadows around him thickened, darkened, took form. Bloated corpses clawed up from beneath the sand, their mouths split in eternal screams. Jawless skulls chattered, and severed arms reached from cracks in the earth, grasping at his legs. He lashed out, cleaving a crawling body in half. Dried sinew and bone snapped beneath his blade, splinters of rib flinging into the air. A second grasped his shoulder. He hacked through it with brute strength, splitting the thing's head in two with a downward arc. Dust and dry rot exploded in a filthy cloud. "Begone!" he howled, a voice like rust grinding against stone. But the apparitions would not stop. They circled him, climbing higher, writhing like a living sandstorm of blame and anguish. They latched onto his armor, tore at his fleshless face, whispered secrets into his ears. The flash, a pulse of ancient power. Everything halted. The figures fell into dust, crumbling into ash that scattered on the wind. The silence returned, so deep it hurt. Before him, scorched into the earth, was a sigil, a symbol of Nehekharan royalty, partially obscured, glowing faintly. A memory stirred. He had carved that symbol with his own blade during the last siege, sealing the outer gate in blood and bone. He stared at it for a long time. Then, wordlessly, he fell to one knee, pressing his gauntleted fist to the emblem. A single thought, unbidden, surfaced in his mind. "I failed, but I still serve." And the wind, for once, did not answer. Chapter 3. The Mausoleum of Stars. The journey to the Mausoleum of Stars was a pilgrimage carved into Setemhotep's bones, one he repeated countless times through drifting centuries, though each step now felt foreign, guided by the twitch of memory rather than command. The sand had shifted since his last visit, burying landmarks and reshaping the city's corpse. What was once a grand avenue lined with obsidian obelisks was now little more than a wind-scoured ravine, choked with rubble and the half-buried remains of forgotten statues. He climbed slowly, joints grinding, ancient sinews stretched thin across brittle bones. His footsteps left shallow imprints in the sand, immediately half-filled by the relentless wind. Overhead, the sky was a pale, washed-out hue, offering no warmth and no time. Only the endless, choking stillness of a world long since abandoned. Then he saw it. The mausoleum loomed ahead like a sleeping beast, half consumed by the dunes. Its once pristine alabaster walls were fractured and pitted, overtaken by invasive roots and time-worn cracks. The twin guardian statues that had flanked its entrance, jackals wrought in midnight stone, were broken, their torsos shattered, their heads lost to the side like a drunken sentinel, its claws outstretched in a futile gesture of protection. Setemhotep's stride faltered. He remembered these statues, remembered polishing them before royal rites, anointing their foreheads with sacred oils. The memory hit like a mallet to his chest. Something inside him trembled, a flicker of confusion, of fear. He approached the entrance, where great bronze doors once stood sealed by magic and command. They now hung askew on rusted hinges, twisted and open like broken wings. He entered without hesitation, passing beneath the shattered lintel, where the royal sigils of House Karabek had once been carved in lapis and gold. Now only faint etchings remained. Inside it was dark. The desert sun could not breach the heavy gloom that clung to the tomb like a mourner's veil. Setemhotep moved by instinct, his steps echoing through the vault. The ceiling, once a dome inlaid with tiny gemstones to resemble the constellations, had partially collapsed. A jagged hole gaped above, letting thin beams of pale light pierce through the gloom and scatter across the floor like celestial fingers. He passed rows of wall murals, once vibrant depictions of royal triumphs and sacred rituals, now cracked and faded, their pigments flaking like ancient scabs. Where noble faces had once been painted with reverence, now only disfigured outlines remained, their eyes gouged or worn to featureless blotches. Then he reached the central chamber. Setemhotep stopped. The scene before him was wrong. The royal sarcophagi, 7 of them, arranged in a crescent moon around the high altar, lay open. Their lids had been tossed aside, some shattered entirely, their interiors desecrated. The gilded wrappings and inlaid hieroglyphics were shredded, burned, defiled. Mummified remains had been pulled from their resting places, bones scattered and armor ripped from brittle flesh. The king's tomb, at the heart of them all, had been split down the center by some unknown force. The ornate faceplate depicting Pharaoh Akhmeren's visage was cleaved in two, one half staring up from the rubble with hollow judgment. Setemhotep fell to one knee. His sword dropped from his hand and clattered loudly across the stone floor. "This," he whispered, his voice a trembling rasp. "This is not the ritual. This is not sleep." He crawled toward the remains of the queen's sarcophagus. The linen shrouds that once wrapped her noble frame now hung from the sides like strips of flayed skin. Her skull was gone, and where her ribcage should have been, only broken splinters remained, scorched black. He reached out with trembling hands and began to pull the wrappings back into place, as if covering a child against the chill. "My queen, forgive them their delay. You are merely at rest," he said. He turned to the others. One by one he knelt beside each desecrated tomb. He brushed away the dust. He gathered fragments of bones, tried to piece together shattered limbs like a sculptor reassembling a masterpiece. He propped up fallen shields, whispered oaths into empty sockets, laid swords across rotted chests. None of them spoke. None greeted him. None thanked him. He paused at the tomb of the royal child, the prince who had once toddled through the court gardens, laughing, sticky with honeyed dates. The sarcophagus was smaller, its lid carved with childlike precision, depicting the young heir clutching a scarab in one hand, a lotus blossom in the other. That lid, too, was shattered. Inside was nothing but dust. Setemhotep sat back, his armored hand closing into a trembling fist. "Where are your souls? Why do you not rise? Have you forsaken me?" The silence pressed down upon him like a burial slab. Then, faintly, a trickle of sound echoed through the chamber. A whisper. Not like the wind. This was within. He turned his head sharply, his eyes flickering with a dull glint of false life. The shadows moved in the corners of the mausoleum, writhing like worms in a corpse. He stood, gripping his khopesh again, and moved toward the altar. The brazier stood there, blackened but intact. He reached into a satchel at his waist and withdrew a pinch of dry herbs, long-dead remnants of sacred lotus. He scattered them into the brazier and, with a flick of flint, ignited a faint flame. The fire surged to life, unnaturally bright, azure and white, casting the chamber in otherworldly glow. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment, standing behind the altar, Setemhotep saw him. Nerekh-Ka, the Liche Priest, cloaked in radiant vestments of bone and gold, his skull serene beneath the weight of his crown, his eye sockets glowing like twin suns. He said nothing. Setemhotep fell to both knees. "My lord, they are not waking. I have waited. I have served. Why do they not rise to greet me?" But the vision faded, like smoke drawn into the night. Alone again, Setemhotep rose and turned back to the tombs. "They are resting," he muttered to no one. "Yes, they are resting. I must guard them. I must keep them safe. They are not dead, not truly. They slumber." And with that he resumed his vigil among the broken tombs, pacing like a lion in a cage of shattered dreams. Chapter 4. The Lich's Flame Extinguished. There were moments, fleeting, jagged, when the past clawed its way through the fog of undeath that clouded Setemhotep's mind. Not memories, not truly. Memories implied clarity, continuity. What he experienced were ruptures, shards of another life driven into the black mire of his consciousness. This time it struck like lightning behind his eyes. A roar of fire, screams echoing through the stone corridors, the sacred halls of the inner pyramid bathed in flickering crimson. He was running, no, being pulled, dragged by unseen forces down the obsidian stairs that led to the chamber of the eternal flame. The world flickered like a broken lantern. The inner sanctum, once anointed with the perfumes of 1,000 years, now stank of ash and iron. Columns lay cracked and split, their carvings weeping molten sap as arcane wards failed one by one. The air sizzled with raw magic, spirals of green fire lashing out from broken sigils on the walls. In the center of the maelstrom stood Nerekh-Ka, High Liche Priest of House Karabek, the warden of the flame eternal. He was surrounded. Dark shapes circled him, not living men, not creatures of this world, black-armored figures with warped blades and faces hidden behind masks of suffering. They moved with unholy speed, whispering in languages that turned the air to vinegar. Chaos cultists, perhaps, agents of ruin from across the northern wastes. Their symbols burned across the walls like mold. Setemhotep watched it unfold, powerless. The Lich's staff trembled in his hands, the sacred flame at its tip, a brilliant sapphire torch passed down since the city's founding, was dimming. Nerekh-Ka roared incantations, his voice a blast of thunder, his will binding walls of golden light between himself and the invaders. It was not enough. They broke through the wards. One lunged forward, a jagged dagger of obsidian plunging deep into the priest's side. He screamed, and the flame at the top of his staff shrieked in tandem, flickering violently as blood, his blood, thick and black as pitch, splattered across the altar. Another blade found his spine, another slashed across his outstretched hand. Fingers flew, spinning across the floor like dry leaves. Till he fought. Nerekh-Ka's jaw unhinged and loosed a final spell, a torrent of necromantic fire that incinerated two of his attackers, melting their flesh into bubbling soup that ran across the stone like spilled oil. But the others did not stop. They converged on him in a frenzy of hatred and blades. And then the final blow. A great hammer, black as void, swung down upon the Lich's skull. It struck with such force that the crown of bone and lapis shattered, spraying the air with fragments of ancient magic. The flame of the staff exploded in a plume of white-hot energy, consuming everything in the room in a burst of light. Setemhotep staggered backward as the vision overtook him fully. Time unraveled, the floor fell away. He screamed without lungs as his mind was seared with the Lich's death, his soul sundered, his power leaking into the walls of Nerekh-Ka like smoke into crumbling stone. And then silence. Darkness. Nothing. Until he woke. How long had passed? Minutes? Centuries? He rose from where he had fallen, deep within the tomb vaults, his body twitching, armor half fused with his necrotic flesh. He looked around, but the other tomb guards were still, lifeless. Without command, they had not stirred. Only Setemhotep remained. Why? He did not know. The spell that tethered his soul to this world had not ended. Not completely. It had frayed. become something half dead, half aware. The will that had once guided him like a beacon, Anaket's mind threading through his, was gone. And in its place, habit, duty without direction, purpose without meaning. He had risen, and so he walked. He patrolled. He saluted bones. He whispered to the dead. He obeyed laws whose authors had long since turned to dust. His world was a tattered scroll looped on repeat. Now, as the vision faded, Setemhotep stood alone once more within the mausoleum's shadow. The torchlight from the vision had long since gone cold. He stared down at his hands, one wrapped in decaying linen, the other holding his chipped khopesh, still caked with sand. He tried to remember the lich's final words, the last spell. All he could recall was the look in Anaket's eyes just before the hammer fell, a moment of horror, of sudden realization. Not fear of death, but fear of abandoning him. Setemhotep's mouth opened. A single sound rasped out, lost on the wind. "Hey, did you leave me?" Chapter 5. Sand-Swept Strangers. The wind howled with a different voice today, a foreign tongue, sharp and erratic. It carried not the dirge of the dead, but the scuff of unfamiliar boots, the chittering laughter of the living, and the clink of steel not forged in the sacred fires of Nehekharan temples. Setemhotep stirred from his vigil beneath the shadow of a collapsed obelisk, his helm half buried in the sand. He lifted his skull-like gaze to the western gate, where dust plumed in strange patterns. Shapes moved beyond the dunes, quick, shifting, careless. Intruders. He rose slowly, the grinding of bone and rusted metal like the turning of a tomb door long sealed. His khopesh slid from its sheath with a rasp, its edge glinting dully in the dying light. He walked, each step a drumbeat of war echoing across the forgotten stones of Nerekh-Ka. Beyond the shattered gate the strangers emerged. They wore odd garments, tight fabrics and layers of mismatched cloth, scavenged from different ages. One bore a scarf wound around his face, goggles strapped to his head. Another had a strange, cylindrical contraption slung over his back, brass tubes and glowing coils, twitching with unnatural energy. Their weapons were crude and ugly, short-bladed machetes, rust-bitten axes, and in one case, what appeared to be a stubby device of steel and wood that clicked when handled. They moved through the ruins like insects, chirping, arguing, laughing. One kicked a fallen urn, scattering the sacred ashes of the high priestess into the wind. Another clambered atop a collapsed statue of Ptah, snapping its sun-dust crown and tossing it aside like trash. Setemhotep saw none of their confusion or poverty. He saw desecration. He saw war. With an otherworldly scream that burst from his dry throat like shattering pottery, he charged. The first man barely had time to turn before the khopesh cleaved through his shoulder, splitting flesh and bone in a spray of arterial mist. The scream that followed was wet and gargled, cut short as Setemhotep reversed the blade and drove it through the man's chest with a sound like rending bark. The others shouted in panic. One raised the metal device, a gun, and fired. The crack of the shot echoed across the ruins like a thunderclap. The bullet struck Setemhotep's pauldron, tearing through aged bronze and splintering the bone beneath. He staggered, but only for a heartbeat. Then he was upon the gunman. With a roar, Setemhotep slammed the flat of his blade against the man's wrist, shattering it in a grotesque sideways bend. The device clattered to the ground. The man screamed, only to be silenced when the undead warrior gripped his throat and drove him into a wall of sandstone, crushing bone with a sickening crunch. His body sagged, twitching. The others scattered. One tried to flee toward the inner sanctum, only to trip over the exposed ribcage of a long-dead priest. He scrambled up, but too slowly. Setemhotep caught him with a downward stroke, his khopesh slicing from clavicle to gut, opening him like a fruit. The man's insides spilled in a steaming coil, wetting the sacred stones with fresh blood for the first time in centuries. Two more scrambled through the gate, stumbling over each other in a mad dash. Setemhotep followed for a few steps, but stopped at the threshold. He would not leave the city. Not again. He stood in the gate's shadow, his chest heaving with shallow instinctive motions. The scent of blood and fear still clung to the air. Bits of torn cloth, cracked gear, and bizarre trinkets littered the ground. He stooped and picked up one of the discarded items, a small, glassy device that blinked with strange lights. It buzzed in his hand, displaying glyphs he could not comprehend. He turned it over, inspecting the smooth surface. It hummed and pulsed, then shattered in his grip like fragile crystal. Nearby, a satchel spilled open. He rifled through it with skeletal fingers, pulling free strange objects, maps of lands he did not recognize, bottles of pungent liquid, and a scrap of parchment etched with unfamiliar handwriting. The letters meant nothing. The paper meant nothing. And yet something deep inside him twisted. He walked slowly back to the plaza, his blade dripping blood and ichor. The echoes of the living had fled, leaving only silence and the strange artifacts that buzzed and blinked like dying fireflies. Setemhotep returned to his vigil. He stared at the horizon as the sun dipped below the dunes. Its crimson light cast long shadows across the bones of Nerekh-Ka. Time had passed. The world had changed, but his duty remained. Chapter 6. The Garden of Bones. The temple gardens of Nerekh-Ka had once been a marvel. Fed by subterranean channels, cooled by carved wind tunnels, it had been a paradise amid the scorched sands, a place of prayer, beauty, and reprieve. Date palms stretched tall above rose bushes, so finely cultivated their petals were said to bleed with the hues of a desert sunset. Priests had called it the crown of life, a sacred tribute to Asaph and Petra alike. Down it was a grave. Setemhotep approached the crumbling archway that led to the gardens, his every step heavy with memory. The bronze gates lay on their sides, twisted by heat and time. Creepers, long dead, brittle and gray, clung to the ruined latticework like the hands of starving beggars. As he entered, a hot wind passed through the bones scattered across the path, rattling them into quiet song. It greeted him like an old friend. He paused, staring into what remained of the once lush courtyard. Where lush hedges had once bloomed, now stood dry brambles twisted into grotesque sculptures. The flower beds were filled not with lilies and saffron, but with rib cages protruding like the hulls of shipwrecks. Vertebrae formed serpentine vines, curling around stone fountains that no longer sang with water, but festered with dust and broken teeth. A tree stood at the center, wide and gnarled. Its trunk formed from fused femurs, its canopy a tangle of shoulder blades and finger bones interlocked like leaves. But to Setemhotep's eyes, the illusion shimmered. He saw petals dancing in the breeze. He saw colors, crimson, violet, gold. He saw his queen. She stood beside the central tree, draped in gossamer silks that shimmered like moonlight. Her face was the sun that guided his soul, unchanged despite the centuries. Her arms were open, her eyes warm. And beside her, their child, no taller than her hip, laughing as he plucked flowers from the earth and offered them with pride. Setemhotep fell to his knees. The metal of his armor groaned, his sword clattered beside him, forgotten. He reached out, trembling, and cupped the illusion of the child's cheek. His skeletal fingers passed through it like smoke, stirring only dry air and the scent of old bones. He did not see this. He did not want to see this. "My son," he whispered, his voice broken glass dragged across stone. "You've grown so strong." He turned to his queen. "You waited for me. I knew you would. The city, it is safe. The enemies are gone. I have kept my oath." No answer. Only the rustle of wind through hollow remains. A single blossom caught his eye, growing near the base of the bone tree. It was shaped like a lotus, but white as chalk, its stem braided with sinew. Curious, he reached for it, and as he touched the petals they fell away, revealing not a seed, but a shriveled, blackened eyeball. It blinked once before crumbling into powder. The vision rippled. The queen turned, her face warping, her eyes weeping pitch, her mouth distorting into a silent scream. The child's laughter became a wet, choking gurgle as his head twisted impossibly far on a snapped neck. Setemhotep recoiled. The illusion fractured. Where the queen had stood, only a skeleton remained, draped in rotted fabric and adorned with tarnished jewelry, bones entwined with roots like she had grown from the soil itself. The child was nothing more than a cracked skull, with a jawbone dangling by sinew, resting in a nest of thorns. He clutched at his helm, issuing a scream that had no voice. The world dimmed. He stumbled back toward the central fountain, now clogged with the torsos of long-dead acolytes. He sat upon the edge, hands limp at his sides. For a long time, he did not move. At his feet, insects crawled across a human femur, stripping it clean. A crow landed upon the rib tree, cawed once, then took to the sky. Setemhotep finally looked up, eyes dim. "You are still here," he said, addressing the empty garden. He reached into his chestplate, withdrawing a single, brittle locket, a relic untouched by time. Inside, the image of his queen and son, etched in gold. He set it on the fountain, carefully, reverently. Then he sat beside it, and did not move for hours. Chapter 7. Awakening Echoes. The wind had teeth that day, sharp, cruel things that bit into the dunes and dragged shrieking clouds of sand across the face of Nerekh-Ka. The air was thick with grit, the sky a bruised amber under the storm's wrath. Setemhotep stood motionless in the central plaza, his cloak snapping like dead skin, his hollow eyes watching the maelstrom as if waiting for command. Beneath the temple steps, something stirred. Unseen for centuries, a relic long buried beneath collapsed masonry and choking dust began to glow faintly, pulsing like a buried heart. It had once adorned the neck of a high priest, a disk of hammered gold, etched with runes that shimmered in ancient Nehekharan script, its center set with a shard of meteoric glass, known as the Eye of Pur. The sandstorm had unearthed it, exposing it to the air and the unnatural power crackling within the desert wind. The storm intensified. A bolt of lightning, purple and forking, struck the plaza. It smashed into a broken statue of the god Jath, exploding the stone in a fountain of debris. Shards flew in every direction. One jagged piece, no larger than a coin, clattered across the steps and struck the relic with a metallic ping. The relic responded. Its inner crystal flared with a blinding light. A ripple of golden energy burst from its surface, arcing across the ground like spilled fire. The plaza became a storm of memory and magic. Setemhotep froze. The wave hit him with the force of a chariot, driving through the barriers of his cursed mind. The world screamed, time shattered. The past awoke. He saw everything. He saw the banners burning atop the palace walls. He heard the screams of civilians crushed beneath invader boots. He saw the Liche Priest Nerekh-Ka staggering through blood-slick corridors, calling upon forgotten gods, desperate and broken. He saw himself, leading the last company of tomb guards into a hopeless defense. The air was thick with smoke and ash. His own blade cracked against demon-forged axes, his armor splitting, his chest pierced by a spear of obsidian. He had fallen then, felt his own blood pour into the sacred stones. He saw Oneket kneel beside his dying body, chanting, weeping, tearing at the heavens. And then the ritual, not performed in triumph, but in despair. The priest had tethered his soul. A rushed incantation, incomplete, not a blessing, but a chain. Setemhotep had risen again, not out of victory, but necessity. His flesh failed, his mind faltered, his king was dead, his family slaughtered, his people burned to ash. He had wandered the city for centuries, enacting rituals for ghosts, worshipping silence, speaking to bones, serving a throne that had long since crumbled to dust. The vision faded. Setemhotep collapsed to one knee, his breath ragged, a reflex, not a need. His bones groaned with the weight of truth. His hand shook as it reached to his chest, brushing against the broken plate where his heart once beat. "I am dead," he whispered, and the words echoed like thunder in his skull. "They are all dead." He looked around. The garden, the statues, the temples, all ruined. Nothing moved but the wind and the carrion birds. He stood again, slowly, as the light of the relic faded behind him. It had returned to stillness, its last energy spent. The clouds above parted just enough for a ray of sunlight to break through, catching on the dried blood that still stained his blade. The sun no longer warmed him. He turned his face toward it nonetheless, a single thought burning through the fog. I was a guardian, I was a father, I was a man. Now he was none of those. He was a memory, bound in fleshless chains, and memory was the cruelest curse of all. Chapter 8. The Denial of Dust. The truth lingered in Setemhotep's mind like rot beneath bandages, undeniable, fetid, and festering. Yet he refused it. He pushed the memory down, buried it beneath centuries of habit and ritual. The storm had passed, and the eye of Prea no longer burned. The relic was once more inert, and with its silence came the cold comfort of denial. He would not be the last. The kingdom could not be dead, and so he rebuilt. With cracked fingers and trembling limbs, Setemhotep dragged shattered stones from the ruins of the court square. He lifted the broken torso of a statue, once depicting Pharaoh Nehekharan in triumph, and fitted it atop a new base carved from tomb slabs and bone. He had no tools, only his khopesh and his stubborn, desperate will. He hammered the stone with the hilt until it cracked into place. The face was gone, weathered away. Still, he bowed to it. "My king returns. The court must be made ready." He wandered through the ruins, retrieving bones, femurs, ribs, skulls bleached to the color of ivory and riddled with wormholes. He gathered the skeletal remains of his comrades, his friends, his brothers, and dragged them back to their old posts. Beneath the shadow of the shattered obelisks, he propped them up like grotesque puppets. He wired their jaws shut with strands of sinew. He set spears in their bony hands, tying them to wrists with strips of rotted linen. One collapsed, its spine snapping from the weight of time. Setemhotep howled in fury and struck the wall, shattering a fresco depicting the queen blessing her people. He fell to his knees. A moment passed. Then two. He rose again, collected the bones, and reset the fallen guard. Ready for inspection. He moved to the palace walls. Where murals had once told stories of glory and divine favor, only faded scars remained. Paint had long since peeled, the plaster beneath blackened and fractured. But Setemhotep would not let that stand. He retrieved a shard of broken pottery, dragged it across his own ruined palm until ichor seeped through the split flesh. The blood was thick and tar-like, necrotic, but it still held color. He dipped the pottery shard into the wound and began to paint. Broad, erratic strokes across stone. He painted the queen's face, round, radiant, but crude, her eyes wide with love. He painted the child in her arms, laughing, though the smile came out crooked, the jaw too long. He painted the royal guards, their spears high, their shields locked, though many were only bones in his memory. He pinched himself, tall and proud, blade raised in salute. But the wind came. It blew grit across his work, eroding the lines even as they dried. Blood ran. Sand clung to wet places. The queen's face melted. The child's mouth stretched, warping into a silent scream. "No," he whispered. "No, they are not gone. They are not gone." He returned to the high dais. The throne was broken, the stone cracked down the middle. He patched it with bricks pulled from collapsed mausoleums. He placed a desiccated corpse in the seat, draping it in scraps of faded silk. He carved a golden mask from a looted funerary door and set it upon the skull. Then he knelt before the throne. "Your Majesty, I have maintained order. The walls stand, the garden flourishes. The people await your word." Silence. Wind. The hiss of shifting sand. The creak of ruined stone under strain. He remained bowed, awaiting a voice that would never come. Hours passed. The sun fell. The shadows grew long. Still, Setemhotep held his vigil, the kneeling warden of a kingdom long since bled dry. All around him, painted ghosts watched from walls. Bone-faced guards stood crooked and silent, and the throne was occupied by rot and lies. But in his mind, they lived. They must live. To admit otherwise was to crumble like the statues, to scatter like the sand. And so he worshipped the dust. Chapter 9. The Final Dirge. His bones ached with every step. Not the sharp jolt of injury, but the deep, gnawing grind of age pressing against time's merciless edge. The magic that had held Setemhotep upright for centuries, woven into him by Anaket's desperate hands, was unraveling. Thin, frayed cords of necromantic power sputtered like dying embers, losing strength with each hour. His joints stiffened, his vision blurred. Fingers once steady on sword hilt and shield now trembled as if gripped by frost. But duty did not waver. Today was his final patrol. He knew it not by revelation or divine whisper, but by the creeping cold that had begun to eat at his spine and the numbness crawling inward from his extremities. His left eye socket burned intermittently, a sign that the phylactery band enchantment embedded there had cracked. Pieces of him were failing. So he donned what armor he still possessed, breastplate cracked from ancient war, helm dented and rimmed with rust, tattered cloak trailing like a funeral shroud, and took to the streets one last time. The city awaited him, and it welcomed him not in ruin, but in splendor. As he passed through the gate of the sun, banners unfurled in an impossible breeze, red, gold, and indigo emblazoned with the serpent of Karabekh. Flowers rained from unseen hands above, cascading across rooftops and domes. Musicians lined the walls with flutes and lyres, their music swelling in harmony with the rhythm of his hollow march. He raised a hand and the crowd roared. In reality, the wind howled through a corridor of broken stone. Strips of cloth, tangled on shattered beams, fluttered like severed limbs in the air. Bones clinked underfoot, but to Setemhotep, they were petals of honor, scattered in his name. He strode into the marketplace. Where once there was silence and sand, now 1,000 citizens lined the streets, draped in robes and golden sashes. They wept with joy, reached for his touch. Children laughed, chasing painted dogs beneath fruit-laden awnings. Women cried out praises to the gods, their voices rising like incense into the air. He saluted them all, spine straight, chin high. But the illusions trembled. The merchant's grin melted into a gaping wound. A child's giggle turned shrill, then vanished. A trumpet note cracked and bled. The color drained from the world in slow streaks, like watercolor left in rain. He clutched his blade tighter, refusing to stop. At the great square before the temple, a vast dais had been erected in his honor, or so he believed. A throne sat atop it, bathed in sunlight. Priests, pharaohs, generals of old all stood in rigid formation, offering him their bows, their approval, their eternal thanks. He climbed the dais. Each step was a struggle. His knees cracked. One leg nearly buckled as his hip joint slipped from its housing with a sickening pop. He jammed it back in with the butt of his khopesh, staggering forward, ichor trickling down his greaves like oil from a cracked urn. He reached the top, turned to face his people. "My brothers, my sons and daughters of Nerekh-Ka." His voice rasped like sandpaper dragged through a tomb. "Hey, I have kept the watch. I have not abandoned you. I have stood where all others fell." The crowd below shimmered. The people were statues. Then bones. Then empty robes drifting on wind. Music died. The sky darkened. Setemhotep's left arm fell limp, disjointed at the elbow. The ligaments turned to dust. His sword clattered down the dais steps, ringing out like a cracked funeral bell. He collapsed to one knee, breathless, voiceless, yet still conscious. The sunlight that had bathed the plaza faded. Clouds rolled in thick and gray, smothering the illusion. Now there was only ruin, collapsed towers, blood-smeared stone, and endless silence. The throne was a pile of rubble. The pharaoh was a heap of bones. Setemhotep looked down at his own hands, blackened bone, fingers crumbling at the tips. Sand blew through the gaps in his ribs. His jaw hung askew. Still, he reached upward, toward the throne, toward the sun, toward whatever god still listened. "Oh, I have served," he whispered. His voice failed. He slumped to the side, dust rolling off his shoulders. The last sentinel of Nerekh-Ka lay still. Chapter 10. The Stillness Eternal. The throne was shattered, its gilded edges flaking like old scabs, its frame bowed under centuries of neglect. Once it had rested beneath the towering pillars of the palace of Nehekharan, flanked by golden statues and curtains woven with sacred runes. Now it stood in the center of a collapsed hall, its dais cracked and buried beneath a thin veil of wind-blown dust and bones ground fine by time. Setemhotep dragged his ruined frame across the chamber. Every movement came with resistance, his right leg trailing behind, the knee long dislocated, the joints of his spine locking with each step. His chest had partially caved inward, ribs snapped from the inside by the collapsing enchantments that had bound him to unlife. The fire that had once flickered within his sockets had dimmed to pale cinders. The throne loomed ahead. He climbed the dais like a penitent. His hand slipped on the stone. He caught himself, fingers cracking and leaving fragments behind. He rose again. Behind him, the halls of Nerekh-Ka groaned as another wall gave way, sending a slow cascade of debris tumbling down. Still, he pressed forward. At last, he reached the throne. It greeted him not with splendor, but with silence. A single faded cobra sigil remained etched into the armrest, chipped but visible. He traced it with his finger, the motion deliberate, reverent. It reminded him of something. The scent of lotus oil, the weight of a ceremonial spear, a voice whispering oaths beneath starlight. Slowly he turned, and with great effort he sat. The throne accepted his weight with a deep creak. a sound like old bones breaking one last time. His shoulders sagged, his helm tilted downward, and his arms fell to the rests at his sides, hands skeletal, fingers broken in 2 places. He sat in silence. The winds howled through the broken city. In the distance, a jackal barked once, and then was still. The stars above gave way to a slow, creeping light. Dawn rose on Nerekh-Ka for the 10,000th time, uncaring, unnoticing. Setemhotep raised his head. His jaw worked slowly, painfully, as he uttered words cracked by age, filtered through a tongue no longer whole. O Petra, judge of the righteous. O Asaph, keeper of spirits. O Japh, god of the quiet crypt. His voice trailed off, rasping like wind over tombstones. His head bowed. Forgive me, I have failed to wake them. The first rays of sun breached the far horizon. They struck the throne room through the cracks in the stones, spilling golden light across the broken tiles and bones. The light reached Setemhotep's face, illuminating the hollow sockets of his eyes. For a moment it seemed he breathed, but the breath never came. With the rising of the sun, Setemhotep's form slumped in the throne. One arm dropped limp to the side. His head tilted just enough to rest against the throne's back, the last flicker of unlife extinguished with the night. He was still, not in sleep, not in vigilance, but in death. The last guardian of Nerekh-Ka had taken his final post, and the gods were silent,